like to welcome everybody out to the Utah Wildlife Board work session, Wednesday, September 16th, 2020 at 1:05 p.m. I'm going to ask the board members, I assume that you've all had an opportunity to review the agenda. And you accept the motion to approve the agenda.
Ms. Carl, I'll make the motion that we approve the agenda for the meeting today.
I'll second that. This is Wade.
Thank you. I'll just do a quick roll call. Kevin Albrecht.
Yes.
Randy Dirth.
Yes.
Donnie Hunter.
Yes.
Carl Hurst.
Yes.
Wade Heaton.
Yes.
Brett Selman.
Yes.
The agenda is approved as presented. Director, would you like to give us a division update now?
I'd be happy to. I think we'll start off today with the aquatic section. This is the time of year when water levels are down, and it makes rotenone treatments much more successful. So we have 4 locations we're doing rotenone treatments on. 2 of those for Bonneville Cutthroat trout restoration, and the other for Colorado River Cutthroat trout restoration. Law enforcement reporting back that the archery hunt was obviously hot and dry, contributed to slower than normal hunt. But the sheer numbers of people that are still out and about recreating are keeping our officers very, very busy. Public support for the officers is very strong. We received 171 UTIP calls, 87 additional cases. So folks that are out recreating are looking for our officers, getting a hold of our officers, letting them know what's going on, and they're making lots of cases. And they actually issued, since the archery hunt started, about 437 citations. So really, really busy. A lot of that focusing on not so much on hunters, but folks out recreating, and the issues involved with having that crush of people out there. So, with regard to AIS, since I last reported, we've inspected 30,000 boats and did 2,200 decontaminations. Now, I need to give Parks and Recreation, our sister agency, some kudos here, because they are assisting equally with our officers, our AIS folks, and their Parks and Rec folks, and they're doing a great job keeping quagga mussel from spreading. So it's been a great partnership. I want to give them kudos. For wildlife, in the week of October 12th, we're gonna capture and GPS collar 20 goats in 3 locations: Willard, the Tushers, and on the LaSalle's. This will give us a better understanding of goat movements, habitat use, and survival. We're currently wildlife section is currently rehabbing 4 bear cubs that have been either abandoned or their mother's been hit by cars. They'll be released in late October. We're rehabbing those bears so that they can be released back into the wild. And there is actually a link, and I'll get that to the board members, so that if you wanted to go in and look at real time at the bears and see them, there's a live camera link to that. So I'll get that to you. Wanted to make mention of the youth waterfowl and chukar hunts that begin this weekend. With regard to administration, I testified, as did Rory Reynolds and Brian Steed, to the Natural Resources Interim Committee yesterday afternoon. It was a good meeting, talking about the sensitive species issue, which we're going to be talking about today. I think that Mike Canning will give you further information on some of the information from that interim committee, and some of the recommendations we'll make to you moving forward for the October 1st board meeting where we can make some decisions. Looking forward to our folks giving some great presentations today on sensitive species and some of the great work we're doing. I think you'll be pleased with the success stories that we can tell and the great work that we're doing with regard to that. So the last thing I wanted to mention was OFWA just finished up its annual meetings virtually on Tuesday. And Miles Moretti, the chairman, CEO of Mule Deer Foundation and former 30-year employee with the Division of Wildlife, received an award from OFWA, a special recognition award. So next time you get to see Miles, he was not there on the thing because he's drew a desert sheep tag and he's out in the desert hunting desert sheep, so he didn't get to actually receive the award. But next time you see Miles, congratulate him. Hopefully you can congratulate him on harvesting these desert sheep as well. So good week for Miles. That's all I have for Justin Shannon just posted on the comments the link to the bear. So if you want to get that link, it's right there. Other than that, Mr. Chair, if there's any questions, that's the end of my report.
Thanks, Mike. Any questions for the director from the board? Hearing none, we'll move on to item 3, Utah Administrative Rule R657-48, Wildlife Sensitive Species. Michael Canning, you're up.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Very thankful to be able to present to you today. My name is Mike Canning, and I'm an assistant director with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. And today I'll be talking to you about the rule we currently use to designate sensitive species in Utah, as well as why it's important to focus on species of conservation need. Let's go to the next slide. Sensitive species designations are covered in State Administrative Rule R657-48. And I think it's important to note up front that sensitive species designations are not part of the Federal Endangered Species Act. This is a state rule that's meant to benefit the citizens of Utah, and its primary purpose is to prevent future listings under the ESA. In Utah, we believe in active species management, so we attempt to identify species that need additional management attention and then take appropriate actions to maintain healthy wildlife populations. These types of actions include habitat restoration, species transplants, surveys, research, and mitigation of impacts. One recent example where you may have noticed some of our active management is with the greater sage-grouse, where federal listing has so far been avoided due to our work and the work of our many partners. If federal listings can be avoided, the negative consequences to Utah citizens, landowners, and our economy that come from federal listings can also be avoided. So that's our goal. And history has shown that if we have data about these species and we're taking actions to manage them, that ESA listings are much less likely. Utah would be in a terrible position if there were petitions to list species under ESA and DWR had not already been working on them. Let's go to the next slide. So just a brief history of the rule. The sensitive species rule was originally implemented in 2001. And that was about the time the legislature gave some dedicated funding to the Endangered Species Mitigation Fund. And we're going to hear about that a little later today, which is a fund that helps us manage these species of conservation needs so that they don't need to be federally listed. The rule was then substantially revised and updated in late 2018 through the RAC and Wildlife Board process. And that change really had us focus on species for which there's a true conservation concern, and not on species that might be rare in Utah but common elsewhere, because those species really aren't a threat to be listed under ESA. So we're really focusing on the species that might be listed. As Mike Fowlks mentioned, because this rule has been a hot topic lately, it was discussed yesterday at the legislature during the Natural Resources, Agriculture, and Environment Interim Committee meeting. During that meeting, several legislators expressed concerns about just the existence of the list. They thought a formal sensitive species list draws attention to those species, and that in itself may lead to future ESA listings. So at that meeting, they asked DWR to go back, revisit this issue, and report back to them next month in October. let's go to the next slide. So we're changing our approach. So based on the public input we've received, as well as the directive from the legislature, we would first like to withdraw all of the proposed sensitive species designations that have been on our website and that you reviewed. Then at your next meeting on October 1st, we plan to formally propose that the sensitive species rule be repealed. We'll continue all of our proactive work on these species of concern, and we'll use working lists to prioritize our conservation actions. So we're prioritizing the right species and actions to prevent ESA listings. Although we're going to propose to repeal the rule, while we have you here today, we'd still like to share some of the work we're doing and some of the work we've already done on species of concern. And just as a summary, if these proposals are followed through, we are going to keep doing the work. We feel it's important to wildlife and to the state of Utah. We just don't have a formal list of species that's been approved by the Wildlife Board. So let's go to the next slide. With that, I'd just like to thank you for your time and be happy to answer any questions you may have. I've kind of thrown some new stuff out there, so happy to try and address any questions or concerns.
Thanks, Mike. Any questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this is Wade. Mike, just a question, and I apologize for not knowing more about this, but so I recognize that this process started. The rule was approved in 2001. Under what direction, what agency? Is this DNR and DWR has taken the lead on it? What department has kind of been in charge of this?
It's a DWR rule, so it's a Wildlife Resources Administrative Rule. I was actually around when it started in 2001, and it was kind of done as a directive from DNR at that point, from the DNR executive director at that time, but it was a DWR rule.
Okay, thank you. No, that's helpful.
Any other questions? Thanks, Mike. That was a good presentation. We'll move on to Utah Conservation Success Stories. Chris Keleher, DNR Recovery Programs Director.
Hey, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had to unmute myself there. Sorry about that. My name is Chris Keleher, and I am the Recovery Programs Director at the Department of Natural Resources. I'd like to thank the Division of Wildlife and the Wildlife Board for the invitation to talk with you today and share some of the information about our program. We're always glad to update people on what we do. Next slide, please. So I think folks are aware the Endangered Species Act was signed into law in 1973, 47 years ago, all with good intentions to really serve as a safety net to prevent extinction of species into the future. But the Endangered Species Act came along with some burdensome regulatory requirements. Once a species is on the endangered species list, it's really hard to get them off that list. When a species is under state management authority, that authority moves over to the federal government once it's listed. So it can only almost be viewed as a failure in terms of state management. And really avoiding ESA listing is really in the best interest of the state. Next slide, please. Our program has a stakeholder advisory committee, and they've referred to the Endangered Species Act as a highway with no off-ramps. Well, we've been making some progress at getting species off the list, but I won't be sharing that today. I'll be talking more about listing prevention efforts. Next slide, please. One of the major responsibilities of our office is to administer the Endangered Species Mitigation Fund. Mike Canning mentioned this. This fund was established by the state legislature in 1997 to serve as a species protection account, protect any plant or animal species identified as sensitive by the state or threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. The primary intent here is to prevent new listings and to recover those species that are already listed. Our office has a vision, and that vision is to eliminate the need for federal regulatory intervention and oversight associated with the Endangered Species Act. Why would we want to do this, and why does the state have this fund? Well, the burdens associated with the Endangered Species Act can really interfere with economic growth, resource use, and development. So this fund is used to do good things for wildlife in an effort to prevent them from becoming listed under the Endangered Species Act. Next slide, please. So the fund has two sources. One is a 16-cent sales tax on water. A portion of that tax goes to our fund. And the other source of funding is a royalty tax from the brine shrimp harvest on the Great Salt Lake. This pie graph shows kind of a typical distribution of this funding on an annual basis. The dark blue, 37%, represents the state's formal commitment to 3 fish recovery programs: the 4 endangered fish in the Colorado River system, the endangered June sucker in Utah Lake, and then the endangered fish in the Virgin River system. And as long as the state is a partner to these recovery programs, and these programs are making progress towards recovery, these programs and the actions they implement serve as the Endangered Species Act compliance, so that we can continue to manage and develop water in those systems for our needs. So these programs are very important, and a big portion of our funding is directed towards those. The purple slice of the pie there, the 14%, is really ongoing efforts, and that funding goes towards implementing recovery for other listed species, like the Mojave Desert tortoise or the Utah prairie dog. We want to continue to make progress towards those species and eventually get them off the ESA list. The red portion of the pie there, the 21%, represents the non-federal match for federal state wildlife grant funding that goes to implement the state's wildlife action plan. That's the Division of Wildlife's lead on that plan, and that is the state plan for preventing new listings in Utah. And the final 23% of that pie graph there goes towards our competitive grants program, and the majority of these actions funded under there also go towards listing prevention. Next slide, please. So this graph here represents the cumulative number of species listed in Utah since ESA was passed. On the left side of the graph, you have number of species, and on the bottom we have year. And you can see by that red arrow there, 1998 was the first year we had funding in the Endangered Species Mitigation Fund. Prior to funding, our rate of listing of federal listed species in Utah was about 1 species per year. Once the funding was established, that rate dropped to 1 species in about every 2.5 years. The rate change really reflects how beneficial this funding has been to the state to prevent these listings. So since ESMF was created, we have had 10 new species listed in Utah, and I'll take a look at those on the next slide, please. So of the 10 species listed since ESMF was created, 3 of those are animals that have broad distributions beyond the borders of the state of Utah. So Utah, in and of ourselves, we had very little opportunity to influence those listing decisions for those 3 animals. The other 7 species are plants. And it may be of interest to folks, we have no state agency with management authority over rare plants, which really leaves a gap in makes us vulnerable here. Recently, our office and DNR partnered with Utah State University to get an expert botanist on staff that can help us work with these plant issues and work with partners to help prevent additional plant listings in the future, because they can give us grief too if they are listed under the Endangered Species Act. Next slide, please. So the Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has the regulatory authority over Endangered Species Act activities. The Endangered Species Act instructs them in Section 4 that their listing decisions need to be based on the best scientific and commercial data available, and after taking into account the efforts being made by a state to protect those species that are under their jurisdiction. So with good information and we can make good management decisions, take good actions, and really have a strong influence on listing decisions. So how do we get there? Next slide, please. I'll just take a little time talking through this slide. There's really 2 phases here, an information gathering phase on the left, and then we get into our action phase on the right. With any sensitive species that hasn't had a lot of interest in the past, we start off with very limited information. We first need to figure out where that species occurs and start to get an idea of what its status is. Once we know that, we can start monitoring the species, monitor its trends and how they relate to threats out in the system, and also how they relate to changes in the environment. We may have to do some research on any given species into the life history and habitat needs of the species, and also look at how those threats could be impacting the species. Once we get enough information gathered, we can start taking management actions if necessary to improve the status of that species. And we'll work with partners to perhaps manage a threat to the species, and then we monitor the response of that species to that management action. We can improve our efforts based on that monitoring, that management action, until we get it right, and hopefully eventually come out with a recovered and healthy population. So if you think back to that previous slide in Section 4 of the Endangered Species Act, good information, they base their decisions on the best available scientific information, and we like to have that best available scientific information as a state agency. We use that information to take conservation actions that then can be considered when that listing decision is made. Next slide, please. So this is just a demonstration of the successes we've had since the Endangered Species Mitigation Fund was created. We've had 25 not warranted findings for species that have been petitioned. Some of these species have been petitioned more than once, like Bonneville cutthroat trout, Columbia spotted frog, pygmy rabbit, least chub. And this is why we need to maintain diligence and continue to do good work for these species, even after we get a not warranted finding. Each of these species has a unique story, and all have the same ending, not warranted for federal listing. Some of these unique stories you'll see in some upcoming presentations. But I'd like to briefly share one story in my next slide. But just looking at this slide, one last thing to mention, each of these not warranted findings represents a big cost savings to the state in terms of having to deal with the Endangered Species Act. Collectively, the cost savings are huge. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief story I'll share from back when I was a field biologist working for the Division of Wildlife. This fish here is a least chub. It only occurs in Utah. And as a field biologist back in the mid-90s, I worked on this species. At that time, it was mostly known from the West Desert and primarily Snake Valley. The Fish and Wildlife Service had found that this was warranted for federal listing under the Endangered Species Act. And they actually proposed to list the species in 1995. Once a species is proposed for listing, there's typically a year wait, and then the Fish and Wildlife Service will finalize that proposal in the Federal Register. And from that time onward, the species is listed until it gets removed from the endangered species list. Fortunately, after this species was proposed, we hit the ground running. We actually found a new population along the Wasatch Front where the species hadn't been seen for over 30 years. And we worked with the Fish Springs Wildlife Refuge and Rotenone to Springhead there and introduced this fish into that springhead to create a refuge population. We introduced about 200 of these fish in May. And when we went back to monitor them in the fall, we had tens of thousands in that spring. This is a short-lived species. They get reproductive in their first year of life, and they just took off. With that information, the discovery of a new population and the establishment of a refuge population, the Fish and Wildlife Service used that information and withdrew their proposal to list the species. We've been managing it ever since under a conservation partnership and been very effective. The species came up again and was petitioned in the early 2000s, triggered by a proposal by the Southern Nevada Water Authority to develop groundwater that would influence Snake Valley in western Utah. Because of the good work we've been able to do under the partnership, we were in a much better position for this petition than we were for the earlier one, and the Fish and Wildlife Service found it not warranted again. Next slide, please. We can't do any of this work without partnerships with our federal agencies, other state agencies, local counties, communities. You know, we've got a saying in our office that I can't really take credit for, but partnerships are the key to conservation effectiveness, and trust is the glue that holds them together. Next slide, please. So just getting back to this figure, you know, on this information gathering side, we feel we're really vulnerable to listing petitions if we're still in that phase when a petition comes along, especially if the petitioner has better data than the state has. This is why it's so important that we have this fund, that we're able to work on these species and gather this information. Once we're in that adaptive management cycle, we feel pretty comfortable that we can withstand a listing petition because we're taking direct action proactively to improve the species, and that gets considered when the Fish and Wildlife Service makes a listing decision. So I got one more slide, please. So in 20 years since the DNR Recovery Office has been in place, Working with DWR and other partners, we've been successful at defending 25 listing petitions. What have we learned? We need good information to make informed conservation and management actions, and a track record of those actions that address the threats to the species and have a positive species response is really our best defense against potential listings. So good information leads to good conservation actions that result in not warranted findings. That's all I have, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thanks, Chris. Randy, mute.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I got a question. Yeah, I was up, maybe I was misinformed or misunderstood, but if I thought if under the rule that we have right now, the sensitive species rule, that if something is listed on there, that we can get additional federal dollars to help with the information gathering of that. If we repeal that rule, are we leaving money on the table somewhere, some federal dollars on the table somewhere that we could possibly be using for some species? Help me understand how that works.
Well, I can respond to that, and then maybe somebody from Division of Wildlife would like to respond as well. We have the State Wildlife Action Plan that the division has put together with a number of partners. And that is really the main avenue for getting federal funding to help with these species. The species that are identified in that Wildlife Action Plan it's a broader list than the sensitive species list, but that is the mechanism that allows us to get state wildlife grant funding, for which our program provides that required non-federal match. I don't know, does anybody from the division want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can just jump in. Chris, what you said is accurate as far as the Wildlife Action Plan goes and Fish and Wildlife Service funding. In addition to that, in preparation for this meeting, we've been in communication with both the Forest Service and the BLM, and they can work through these issues based on our other lists. If we don't have a sensitive species list, they've been, other federal agencies have on occasion used our sensitive species list for funding decisions or other things, but they can work through it if we're using an internal working list or some other list.
Very good, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, this is Wade. Could I ask a question as well?
Go ahead, Wade.
So, Mike, I'm just trying to catch up here a little bit with your announcement. So, what does this mean as far as just our normal workings with regard to these species? If I'm hearing you correctly, we're just going to do away with the act, which does away with the formal sensitive species list, but certainly we're going to continue these efforts to do all the things we've been doing to keep them off the endangered species list. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think that's accurate. And I think the big difference is there will just not be a formal list that's been endorsed by the Wildlife Board. So, we'll keep working on the species as we prioritize them. It just won't have that formal endorsement by a decision-making body like the board.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Chris or Mike? Thanks, Chris. That was a great presentation. Next, we'll go to Utah Watershed Restoration Initiative and Sensitive Species. Tyler Thompson, DNR Watershed Restoration Initiative Director. Tyler, you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Tyler Thompson. I'm the Watershed Program Director with the Department of Natural Resources. I oversee the Watershed Restoration Initiative, or as we always call it, WRI. So I know you guys had a work session a few months ago where WRI was detailed by Daniel Eddington, so I don't want to talk a lot about the makeup of the program, but just briefly wanted to mention WRI is a partnership-based program in Utah to improve high-priority watersheds throughout the state. With the closing of fiscal year 2020, we are now entering our 15th year. Through the life of the program, we've now completed nearly 2,300 projects and improved just over 2 million acres in the state of Utah. And we often talk about the three legs of WRI and what we're all about. WRI is focused on improving three ecosystem values. Number one, watershed health and biological diversity. Number two is water quality and yield. And number three is improving opportunities for sustainable uses of natural resources. And although WRI focuses on game and sport fish species, and we often highlight those different projects, WRI also has, as part of its central goals, two things. Number one is the listing prevention from the Federal Endangered Species Act, or ESA listing prevention. WRI, like ESMF, believes that species in Utah are better managed under state control, and we do everything we can to keep those species under state management. Number two is the goal of removing or downlisting species that are currently listed under the ESA. And we often know that habitat issues are often central to federal ESA listing petitions. And WRI has been Utah's foremost program for dealing with these issues over the past decade and a half. To that end, it may be of interest that of the nearly 2,300 projects that WRI has completed over the life of the program, over 60% of those completed have included benefits to at-risk species. So as projects are developed and proposals are entered and sent through the ranking process, project managers are required to list all of the species that they believe will be benefiting from that project. And over 60% of those projects have benefited at-risk species. To aid in this goal, WRI, through its regional ranking process, elevates proposals that include concrete conservation actions that benefit these species of greatest conservation need, in addition to the game and sport fish benefits. We've developed a system where species that are most imperiled are given higher points through the ranking process. And those projects that are developed to benefit both game and sport fish and sensitive species are actually elevated above those that only have single benefits. So we do everything we can to not only fund projects that benefit one or two game species, but also those projects that extend their benefits to sensitive species. In addition, WRI has adopted the ethos of do no harm. As these projects are developed and reviewed through the regional process, we've developed a system where DWR sensitive species biologists review all of these projects, not only for accuracy of the listed benefiting sensitive species that are on those proposals, but we're also asking them to review these projects for any possible negative effects that these proposals may have. As a program, WRI has always been and will always be focused on project improvement, and reducing long-term negative effects to sensitive species are a big part of this. As part of this goal, WRI has helped to fund research and monitoring for sensitive species as part of the project implementation budgets each year. And that includes long-term research and monitoring. WRI also believes that it's very important for us to look forward to new sensitive species. You know, in a way, we're looking to try to predict the future. We found it is extremely important for us to pay attention to the rumblings in the sensitive species world to help us anticipate future problem species. As you know, WRI projects are often completed across ownership boundaries and often include work that takes place on federal lands. And as we're aware, any federal action that is submitted through WRI first has to go through a NEPA analysis before it can be implemented. This NEPA analysis process gives environmental groups who are opposed to any kind of active management the opportunity to stall these projects. This includes not only federal lawsuits, but also the agency's internal review processes, such as BLM's Internal Board of Land Appeals, or the IBLA process. For the first decade or so of WRI's existence, we saw very little negative response from these groups. That has really changed in the past few years. BLM especially is being challenged on many of its pinyon and juniper removal projects. And with BLM, we stand side by side with them and consider that a challenge to us as well, particularly if these projects are near or located within national monuments or citizen inventory wilderness areas. And one example I'd like to talk about recently with the BLM and WRI, we had begun developing a project within the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. The project was named the Scudampaw Terrace Project, and it was going through federal NEPA review. This project was very similar to work that had taken place in and around this same area outside of the monument, and had actually even been challenged outside of the monument, and we had prevailed. So in this case of September of last year, the BLM's IBLA ruled that the BLM had failed to take a hard look at the project's cumulative impacts on migratory birds, and also that BLM failed to show that using non-native seed was consistent with the applicable land use plan. This was a surprise to us. This challenge took this large and desperately needed project and sent it back to the drawing board after losing this appeal. One of the reasons for the alleged lack for the IBLA loss was the alleged lack of population and project effect data for the area on migratory birds, with a large focus being on pinion jays, a species that wasn't on our list and was really only beginning to be on our radar. With very little evidence, the range-wide reduction in pinion jays is currently being blamed partially on pinion and juniper reduction projects. We in the state of Utah need to combat this with Utah-specific information related to our projects and their effects on pinion jays. This example and others from around the state really show the need for WRI to keep current and even to see into the future when it comes to species at risk and how WRI projects may negatively affect these species. To that end, WRI has again helped fund research and monitoring and inventories of declining species that may be weaponized in the future through the NEPA process to stall future WRI projects on federal lands. Following these recent setbacks, WRI and our partners are now laser focused on pinion jays. And so far, the news is very good. We are now finding through our research and monitoring efforts that pinion jay colonies in numbers are being found in much higher numbers than we had expected. In fact, the more that we survey, the better the news gets. There are even theories being explored that the range-wide reduction in pinion jay numbers could actually be due to the lack of heterogeneity in the pinion juniper and sagebrush habitat type. In other words, it is possible that we need to be doing more pinion juniper treatments to help diversify these age classes and vegetative types. Without this specific information, the prevailing narrative that PJ treatments are harmful to pinion jays would win out. So in conclusion, I believe that WRI is a better program overall because of its diverse sets of resource goals. Improving habitats for at-risk species is an important part of keeping watersheds healthy and productive here in Utah. And that concludes my remarks. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Tyler. I mean, it's incredible what you've accomplished in 15 years. 2 million acres improved and 2,300 projects. Congratulations. Any board members have any questions for Tyler?
Tyler, this is Kevin Albrecht. Do you feel that the sensitive species list, with the monitoring and the data that they have, has helped assist you with in the WRI efforts?
So we haven't used the sensitive species list through the WRI process simply because it hadn't been updated in many years. We'd actually use the Wildlife Action Plan list. And yes, that's been very helpful through the process. That's really what we use to help elevate those projects that we believe will benefit sensitive species.
Any other questions? Thanks, Tyler. We'll move on to our next agenda item. Examples of item 6, examples of species proposed for removal from sensitive species list. Bonneville cutthroat trout. Randy Oplinger, sport fish coordinator.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Like you said, my name is Randy Oplinger, and I'm the Coldwater Sport Fish Coordinator for the division. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present to you a sensitive species success story here in Utah. So I really just want to tell the story of the Bonneville cutthroat trout. This is a species that really at one point in time we thought was extinct here in Utah, and now it's very abundant here in the States. We've done a lot of work over the last 30 years or so to really bring this species back to where it is today. And really a lot of the success we have can be attributed to the fact that this species was on the sensitive, or was designated sensitive species here in Utah, and really how that designation catalyzed a lot of the work that we've done and built some good conservation momentum that brought this species back here in our state. So you go to the next slide. So where I want to start is I just want to talk a little about why we care so much about the Bonneville cutthroat trout. So cutthroat trout broadly are the only trout species that are native here to Utah. So as we hear about other trout species like rainbow trout, brook trout, brown trout, lake trout, other species, they're all non-native. These are all species that were introduced to Utah after settlers arrived here in the state. If we look specifically at cutthroat trout, there's multiple subspecies of cutthroat trout that are spread really throughout the western part of the United States. Here in Utah, we've got 4 of those subspecies, and Bonnevilles are one of those subspecies that we have. If we look today, the Bonneville is one of the more popular species among anglers here in the state. The Bonneville's range is really kind of centralized in the western part of the state, and it can be found really in a lot of our major population centers here in Utah. So if we look up and down the Wasatch Front, we look at Ogden, look at Salt Lake, we look at Provo. These are all areas that are right in the heart of the natural range of the Bonneville cutthroat trout. So as anglers from those areas, those populated cities are going out in their fishing areas close to their home and they're catching cutthroat trout, there's a good chance that the cutthroat trout that they're catching are in fact Bonneville cutthroat trout. And then also over the last few years, we've started the Utah Cutthroat Slam program. This encourages anglers to get out and catch the 4 cutthroat subspecies that we have here in Utah. And this species, so the Bonneville, is part of that program. That's one of our more popular fish in that program. So if you kind of look at where we stand right now, Bonneville cutthroat trout are very important in terms of a species that anglers target here in the state. If we provide a little bit more historical context, Bonneville cutthroat trout are actually important to the legacy here in Utah. When settlers first arrived here in the state, they caught a lot of fish for subsistence, and Bonneville cutthroat trout were an important part of their diet at the time. So really as a result of this importance of the Bonneville cutthroat trout, both historically here in the state, and also the role it plays currently in terms of its popularity among anglers, it actually makes it our state fish here in Utah. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is I want to start this story about the history of the Bonneville cutthroat trout by talking about where we stand today with this species. So we currently have more than 200 conservation populations, and then of those 200 conservation populations, at least 55 of them are what we categorize as core populations. Now the difference here is that Bonneville cutthroat trout, like all other cutthroat trout, got hybridized with other trout species, so rainbow trout and other cutthroat trout species. And we've seen a lot of that hybridization happen, and that's partially been attributed to the decline of our cutthroat population. So the difference between a conservation population and the core populations are really that level of genetic purity among the fish, where the core populations have a little bit higher purity standard than the conservation populations. We also currently have more than 2,728 miles of stream here in the state that have Bonneville cutthroat trout, and they currently occupy 39% of their historic range. Now we talk about the historic range, we're really comparing what they currently occupy against what they occupied or what we think they occupied back in 1800. Since then, there's been a lot of habitat modification that's happened. And as a result of that, there's areas that historically Bonneville cutthroat trout could occupy that they currently can't occupy. So this 39% value might not sound a lot, but it actually represents the vast majority of the range that they currently can occupy today. So we're in a good place with Bonneville cutthroat trout. They really are occupying pretty much everywhere that we could expect them to occupy here in the state. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the range of the Bonneville. It's shown on the orange part of the map. If you look at the map, you can see kind of in the yellow dotted lines, you can see the outline of the states. Really, the bulk of the range of the Bonneville cutthroat trout lies here in Utah. And as I mentioned, it's primarily centered in the western part of the state. Part of the range also bleeds over into Nevada, Wyoming, and Idaho as well. But like I mentioned, this species is really occupied or really dominant here in the western part of the state. And that's the part of the reason why it is so popular among our anglers. Is it's so accessible and it's really close to a lot of our population centers here in Utah. Next slide, please. So I just a couple slides back talked about how well Bonneville cutthroat trout are doing. But if you look back about 50 years ago, that wasn't the case. And if you go back to the late 60s, we actually thought that they were extinct. There was a lot of reasons as we look back on things and why we thought they were extinct at the time. One of the big reasons is non-native fish stocking. As I mentioned earlier, some non-native fishes that we stocked, for instance, rainbow trout and other cutthroat trout subspecies, actually hybridize with Bonneville cutthroat trout, which pose some problems. And then there's other species like brown trout and brook trout that actually compete heavily with Bonneville cutthroat trout, and that certainly was attributed to some of our declines in our Bonneville populations. Habitat loss and degradation also had an impact on our Bonneville populations. And there's also some instances where overharvested fish were implicated in their declines. Next slide, please. So as I just talked about in the late 1960s, we thought that they were actually extinct. And then in the 1970s, we had a bit of a glimmer of hope. And that really started in 1976, where we discovered really the first 3 populations of Bonneville cutthroat trout that we'd seen in a number of years here in the state. Those 3 populations were found in the southern part of the state. So 2 of them were found in the Virgin River drainage. And the 3rd population was found just upstream of the town of Beaver. Then in 1978, we found 15 additional populations. And the good news about those 15 populations, they weren't just found in the southern part of the state, they were found really scattered throughout the state. So what that told us is we really had some relic populations, and the populations that were holding on really spread throughout the state. One thing I do want to point out is the populations that we were discovering there in the 70s were discovered really in headwater areas. And this is important because these headwater areas are generally very isolated. So on the previous slide, I talked about how the introduction of non-native fish, how habitat loss, and how overharvest really had a huge impact on our Bonneville populations. Well, these populations we were discovering were again in those isolated headwater areas, and those areas, just because they're less accessible, are less affected by those impacts that I just described. Next slide, please. So the rediscovery of Bonneville cutthroat trout really prompted us about 30 years ago to designate them as a state-sensitive species. And really that designation and the overall perilous status of Bonneville cutthroat trout really got us working towards trying to conserve the species and bringing the species back here in Utah. So some of the things of this perilous status and this overall designation of Bonneville cutthroat trout dead is it increased the overall awareness both among us as biologists and also the public of the status of Bonneville cutthroat trout and the fact that they weren't doing so well here in our state and really throughout their range. Also, the status brought together a lot of new collaborative partnerships among various state agencies, federal partners, non-governmental organizations, and private partners. And really, through these collaborations, all these partners were working together in a common direction. We were all coming together to do our part to bring Bonneville cutthroat trout back here, both in Utah and throughout their range. Also, the status led to new funding opportunities being available both on a federal scale and a state scale. And those funding opportunities allow us to bring a lot of money to the table so we can do good work on the ground to help bring Bonnevilles back. Also, at the same time in the late 90s, we started working on a conservation agreement and strategy for the Bonneville cutthroat trout. And then associated with that were a number of other documents like statewide plans and a genetic conservation plan. And really what all those plans did, so the agreement, the strategy, and all those other associated documents did is they really kind of laid out a roadmap on the steps that we were going to take to bring Bonneville cutthroat trout back. And then finally, we put on the ground just numerous conservation measures that really started to restore the species, both here in Utah and throughout their entire range. Now, one thing I do want to point out is if you look at the history of the story of the Bonneville cutthroat trout, there have been 2 federal petitions to list the species under the Endangered Species Act. In both cases, those petitions were deemed not warranted. And to a large extent, the reason why they were deemed not warranted was because of the process that we followed. So the fact that we increased awareness, we built partnerships, we brought in funding, we had a roadmap through our conservation agreements and strategies, and then we started implementing conservation measures. When the Fish and Wildlife Service looked at these petitions and saw the work that we were doing, what they realized is us as a state, we were going to be capable of carrying out the work that we needed to do to bring this species back. And there was a feeling among the federal government they didn't need to intervene to do anything for Bonneville cutthroat trout. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, over the last 30 or so years, we've been doing a lot of conservation actions that have helped to bring the Bonneville cutthroat trout back here in Utah. Quickly, I just want to run through some of these actions we've been carrying out, and really it started with us doing a comprehensive search for new Bonneville populations. Over the last 30 or so years, we've gone and we've looked everywhere we could conceivably think that Bonnevilles might occupy, and we've looked for populations, and in some cases, we've identified some populations through these search efforts. The next thing we've done is we've done a lot of non-native fish removal efforts. This is primarily through the use of rotenone. And what we've done is we've taken cases where we've got non-native fish that are invading Bonneville cutthroat trout habitat, and we've removed this non-native fish and restored that habitat to our Bonnevilles. Another thing that we've done over the past few decades is we've really used a lot more sterile fish in our stocking program. So sterile fish is a fish that's not able to reproduce. And what this allows us to do is provide sport fishing opportunities for the public, while at the same time giving us a species that can't reproduce. So we have better control over the numbers of fish because they don't establish naturally reproducing populations. And this allows us to kind of jointly manage these fish that we're stocking along with our cutthroat trout. So we're able to do it for the benefit of our cutthroats and make sure that their populations are still robust. Another thing we've done is a lot of broodstock development efforts where we started taking more and more eggs from wild fish, putting them in our hatcheries. We're able to raise them out. And that allows us to produce more fish from our hatcheries that we can stock out in the wild to help accelerate some of our Bonneville cutthroat restoration efforts. And then finally, we've really increased our amount of monitoring with Bonneville cutthroat trout, where we're trying to keep as good tabs as possible on our Bonneville populations, with the idea that at one point in time we thought that they were extinct. We don't want that to happen again. So we're trying to do our part to really increase our amount of monitoring to make sure that we're keeping tabs on our populations so we don't get back to that state again. Next slide. So this graph right here really kind of summarizes our restoration efforts with the Bonneville cutthroat trout. So on the vertical axis, I'm showing the number of conservation populations that we have, and I'm showing the year across the horizontal axis. And again, it really started in 1976, where we discovered 3 populations, and today we've got over 200 populations of Bonneville cutthroat trout. Now, there's really one key time point in this series I just want to point out, and that's in the early 90s, and that's when the sensitive species designation happened for the Bonneville cutthroat trout. And as I talked about earlier, that designation really started the process that were followed for the restoration of the Bonneville. So it started us bringing partners together and getting new funding, and it started us coming up with conservation agreements and strategies and carrying out actions for the benefit of the species. And what you can really see is since the early 90s, there was a sharp increase in the number of populations that we had for Bonneville cutthroat trout, and that could be attributed to those actions that we started to initiate. You can really see those actions taking effect and led to an increase in the number of Bonneville populations we have. Now, if you look over the last 10 or 15 years, you'll see a progressive decrease in the number of populations we're adding, and that's not really related to us slowing down our restoration efforts per se, or us decreasing our effort. What it really represents is we're starting to get to the end goal here, where we're running out of opportunities to restore Bonneville cutthroat trout. And as a result of that, we are really slowing down as a result of our restoration efforts. So that's a good place to be in. We're just running out of opportunities to do additional work with the Bonneville. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I want to say is that really our conservation actions that we've carried out have secured Bonneville cutthroat trout. So we're at a place now where, 50 years ago, we were worried that Bonnevilles are extinct. Today, we feel very good about their status in the landscape, and we feel that the Bonnevilles really aren't going anywhere. And again, that could be attributed largely to the process that we followed. So bringing the partners together, the funding together, and coming up with various plans and starting to do things on the ground really was the catalyst to our efforts to recover the Bonneville cutthroat trout. And also this process really brought in additional funding, which is an important role in the process that we followed. Next slide, please. So just kind of looking ahead over the next few years, what we're actually looking to do, because we feel very good about the status of the Bonneville cutthroat trout, is we want to begin to divert the attention that we historically invested into the recovery of the Bonneville cutthroat trout into other sensitive species here in the state. And we want to use what we learned from the Bonneville cutthroat trout really as a template for restoring other species. So what we would like to do is follow the process and what we learned from the Bonneville and carry it forward and build on that momentum and restore more and more species following that same model here in the state. Next slide. Now, in addition, what we're hoping to do over the next few years is we really want to position ourselves as an agency to a point where we can really proactively respond to any changes in population status with the Bonneville cutthroat trout. So we're looking at further improvements in our monitoring methods, further habitat improvements, and we're also trying to anticipate the impacts that human population growth and environmental change might have on our Bonneville cutthroat populations. So what we want to do is we want to put ourselves in a position where we not only feel good about Bonneville cutthroat trout, but in a position where we have good mechanisms in place where we could quickly detect any changes in population status so we can respond very quickly, and we're staying ahead of the curve. We're not letting populations decline, but we're doing everything that we can to keep populations robust here in our state. Next slide, please. And then one thing I really want to point out is the actions that I talked about weren't carried out alone. There's a lot of partners that are involved in the work that we conducted, and we would not be where we are today with Bonneville cutthroat trout if it wasn't for the actions of these partners. So I just want to point out that other states like Wyoming, Idaho, and Nevada, who also have Bonneville populations, have been just involved with the restoration of Bonnevilles as we have in Utah. Excuse me, we have federal partners like the Forest Service, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the BLM, the Bureau of Reclamation, who have been important partners in the work that we've done. We've done a lot of work out in the West Desert. We've got some native populations of Bonneville cutthroat trout out there, and the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute Indian Reservation. We're important partners in that work. We also have university partners like BYU, Utah State, and Idaho State University. We've conducted a lot of research, and over the last 20 or 30 years, their research has helped us learn a lot about Bonnevilles, and we've been able to implement what they've learned in a lot of the work that we've done. That's helped really improve the status of the species over time. Also, we have non-governmental partners like Trout Unlimited, who are important partners, and they carry out a lot of work on the ground that have benefited Bonnevilles. And then finally, we've got private partners. Pacificor has been an important partner. And then it's not showing up here, but there's numerous private landowners who have allowed us to have access to their land, and they've really encouraged and helped us really carry out a lot of the restoration work that we've conducted with Bonnevilles. And we certainly have to thank them for their efforts. They've had an important role in where we are today. Next slide, please. So I just want to thank everyone for your time today. I'd be more than happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Randy. Questions from the board? Hearing no questions, we'll go on to the three-toed woodpecker, Russ Norvell, Avian Conservation Coordinator.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the Wildlife Board. Let's see, are you seeing the presentation yet?
Not yet.
Well, there we go. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and the Wildlife Board. Thanks for taking the time to learn more about these species in our programs this afternoon. I'm the non-game avian program coordinator, and it's my job to look after all the birds that we do not hunt, from Gunnison sage grouse and condors to pelicans to falconry and to everything else. It's a pretty diverse group. And our overall goal here is to have healthy wildlife populations for all the species and for the people of Utah. But to do that, we need to see our problems clearly and to bring everyone's focus together in order to solve them. This allows us to do three big things: retain state management authority by defining for ourselves what are the most important things, and then acting on them by focusing partnerships on our problems before they become dilemmas. And when we stay current, we avoid losing relevance with the public and credibility with the service. As the board knows from big game, wildlife management is a dynamic process, and we need to change with the times. We're going to get stuck in the past. Perhaps the best context for bird conservation in Utah is the comprehensive 2019 article in the journal Science, The Decline of the North American Avifauna. We've lost over 2.9 billion birds in North America in the past 50 years. These declines have hit some groups harder than others, but nearly every group has taken a hit. Western birds between forests, grasslands, and shrub steppe. I'm sorry, good grief. We're not advancing slides here, are we? Can we back up there just a scotch? The next slide, please.
Mike, you out there?
You got anybody there, Mike? Looks like we got some technical difficulties here. There we go. Here's our second slide. Here's the three big things. Retain state management authority, define for ourselves what the most important things are, then act on them by focusing our partnerships on the problems before they become dilemmas. As I said, when we stay current, we avoid losing relevance with the public and credibility with the service, which we need to fulfill our mission. As the board knows from Big Game, wildlife management is a dynamic process and will need to change with the times. Next slide, please. The best context for bird conservation in Utah is the comprehensive 2019 article in the journal Science, The Decline of the North American Avifauna. We've lost over 2.9 billion birds in North America in the past 50 years. And these declines have hit some groups harder than others, but nearly every group has taken a hit. Western birds between forests, grasslands, and shrub steppe have lost a lot more than most. So I think when we make headway, it's against a headwind. Next slide, please. To understand where all this is coming from, you need to know that birds often have a ton more data than other taxa. They're charismatic and colorful. There's a lot of work being done, some of it since the turn of the century. There are national surveys to get large-scale trends from, and to get regional and state-specific data, we collaborate on regional-scale projects. And finally, we typically have dozens of species-specific studies to look at. These give us a lot of what we need, but not everything, and usually not at the state scale. Next slide, please. The basic challenge with bird conservation work is that we have a lot of birds to work on. There are 465 bird species that use every habitat in the state. 231 of them breed here. And it's still hard to find Utah relevant data unless we do it ourselves. And because none of these species are found only in Utah, regional partnerships are crucial. We literally cannot succeed alone. But then there's a ton of relevant jurisdictions, which means there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So there's a lot of status assessments and whole ranking systems that need to be respected and incorporated. And to avoid surprises, we work closely with the service and the Pacific Flyway Council, the Western Working Group of Partners in Flight, and many species-specific working groups. While partnerships are effective at raising issues and coordinating regional direction, states are where the work gets done on the ground. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, it can be a challenge to get species-specific bird data for Utah. To deal with the sheer volume of need, we take a community approach whenever we can. But many conservation targets are specialists that need customized approaches. For example, woodpeckers in alpine habitats start their breeding cycle well before other birds, and usually before the snow is off, and so are largely missed by community bird surveys. Next slide, please. We use all these data to set conservation priorities and direction. We identify the main threats and work to focus our partnerships on effective, positive actions. Next slide, please. I'm going to conclude with one of our success stories, the American three-toed woodpecker. Three-toads were one of Utah's first conservation concerns, identified back in the early 1990s. But the threats weren't well documented. Some of the available national trends were kind of a wash. Surveys were done in mostly the wrong season, and none of it was specific to Utah. Back up one. Oh, there you go. There you go. Sorry. So ultimately, we didn't have any real data to refute the concerns. In the 1990s, we didn't know we didn't know in the 90s, basically. Next slide, please. A little natural history. Utah is near the southern range extent of the species. There are 3 recognized subspecies. We have Picoides dorsalis here. Nationally, their range has been contracting northward and upward, but we also knew that they moved into areas after disturbances such as wildfire and beetle kill. Next slide, please. We successfully applied for competitive ESMF survey funding in 2010 and 2013. And when looking in the right habitat in the right season, the right methods, we found them in their expected habitats over 2/3 of the time. So we documented they were widespread, if rare. Next slide, please. But as they were still everywhere we expected them to be, but they were still everywhere we expected them to be. Now, we may have concerns in the future if and when forests fall, so we'll keep an eye on them with our partners. But until then, we're in the golden years for these woodpeckers. Next slide, please. Once the species was formally evaluated in studies, we determined it was not an immediate conservation concern. Next slide. Our partnerships continue to be critical in conserving all of Utah's birds. When it comes to bird conservation, partnerships are really the key to success. These are just some of our partners on one of our projects. Last slide, please. And thank you again for your time and interest. Keep it short and sweet.
Thanks, Russ. Any questions from the board for Russ? Now we'll move on to number 7, examples of species proposed for inclusion on sensitive species list. The Western pearl shell, Kate Holcomb, aquatic biologist. Go ahead, Kate.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and hello, everyone. I'm the division's native mollusk expert, and today I'm going to be talking about Western pearl shell conservation in Utah. For those of you that are not familiar with this species, it's a freshwater mussel. Some people call them clams. The picture here shows some shells, which are easier to find than the living mussels themselves. Despite this species' dull appearance, I hope you'll be pleasantly surprised and interested in what I have to say about this species today. Next slide. To get started, I wanted to give you all some perspective about where we are with Western pearl shell conservation in Utah. If you remember our discussion about Bonneville cutthroat trout, you can think of Western pearl shells as being in the same boat as the trout back in the 70s. And this is why we need to prioritize conservation efforts for Western pearl shells now. Because if we can follow the lead of the Bonneville cutthroat trout conservation efforts, the future for Western pearl shells in Utah will be bright. Next slide. But before we go any further, talking about Western pearl shell conservation specifically, let's take a few minutes to talk about what you're all probably wondering: why care about freshwater mussels? First of all, freshwater mussels are among the most highly imperiled groups of animals in North America. Next slide. But we should also care about freshwater mussels because they're valuable to us in a surprising number of ways. Culturally, freshwater mussels have been important to Native Americans as food, and the shells have been used for tools, ornaments, and in ceremonies. Historically, freshwater mussels had economic value in the United States. They were widely used for buttons until the 1960s when plastics became popular. Next slide. From a more ecological standpoint, freshwater mussels are valuable as indicator species. A big reason for this is because they can't quickly run or swim from a threat. As you can see, they just have one tiny little foot. So if freshwater mussel populations are declining, often it's because there has been a disturbance to the environment, and sometimes it's only a matter of time before other animals are also impacted by that disturbance. Freshwater mussels also do an excellent job of filtering water, as you can see in this picture. And this is beneficial to other aquatic organisms, and it's also beneficial to us for cleaner water for drinking and swimming. Other ecosystem services that freshwater mussels provide include nutrient cycling. Their empty shells provide habitat to crayfish and small fish, and they are also food for muskrats and other mammals. Next slide. So in general, freshwater mussels are valuable and critical, really, to healthy, functional aquatic ecosystems. Protecting freshwater mussels will protect our water and everything else living in it. Next slide. Now that we all understand the value of freshwater mussels, hopefully the conservation efforts for them will make a little more sense. So let's now get back to some specifics about Western pearl shell conservation in Utah. Historically, Western pearl shells were widely distributed across the northwestern part of the United States, and it was present in Utah. But after surveys in the 1980s to 1990s failed to find living Western pearl shells, it was widely accepted that they were probably extirpated or no longer present in Utah by about the year 2000. Luckily, they were rediscovered in 2009, and since then, the question has been, are they truly rare? And is there something that we can do to ensure that their persistence remains in Utah? Next slide. Well, recent snorkel surveys by division biologists are finding that maybe they're not as rare as we once thought. In the past, we only knew of about 20 living individuals, but since 2019, we now know that there are more than 400 living individuals in Beaver Creek in Summit County, and they're reproducing because we've been able to find the juvenile mussels. So this is great news. Next slide. But moving forward, there are some things that we'll need to do to ensure their long-term persistence in Utah. First, we need to continue the search for new populations. The more populations we have, the more Western pearl shells will be able to withstand threats. If we find that there are only one population of Western pearl shells, then raising mussels in a hatchery type facility might be needed to bolster their population. There are also some research needs that will help us better protect the mussel. We need to know more about their habitat needs so that we can properly restore habitat for them if that's needed. We might need to know, do the mussels prefer more boulders in the stream or do they like more sand? You need to ask questions like this. We also need to know what their host fish needs are so that we can make sure that they're successfully reproducing. As you can see in the diagram, Western pearl shells require a host fish to complete their life cycle. And if the fish is not present in the river when the mussels are spawning, the mussel will not be able to reproduce successfully. So obviously this is a huge potential issue for the conservation of Western pearl shells. As a side note, the life cycle is one of the most interesting and important things to understand about a freshwater mussel. And I could talk about this for a long time, but we don't have forever today. So if people are interested in this, maybe we can go into more detail later. Next slide. To make all this future work a reality and a success, partnerships will be critical. Already, we've had Utah State University help with eDNA surveys to help hone in on where the Western pearl shells might be. ESMF, as Chris mentioned earlier, has been providing funding for snorkel surveys. If propagation is needed to bolster our mussel populations, assistance from a partner will be needed. WRI, which Tyler was talking about earlier, will be an excellent partner for any future habitat restoration projects that might be needed. And partners like Trout Unlimited, local news outlets, and schools will be helpful in public education and increasing awareness about Western pearl shells. Next slide. To wrap up, I'd like to reiterate that although Western pearl shells might not look like much, they do have a great deal of value to us and the environment. The more we know about the status, distribution, host fish needs, habitat needs for the species, the better we'll be able to protect them and prevent them from being listed under the Endangered Species Act. And in the process of protecting Western pearl shells, we'll also protect entire aquatic ecosystems from bottom up, water quality, habitat, aquatic insects, and fish. Next slide. Finally, if Western pearl shell conservation can follow the example of Bonneville cutthroat trout, the future for Western pearl shells in Utah will be bright. Again, the success of the Bonneville cutthroat conservation story started by first designating it as a priority sensitive species. Once that designation was in place, motivation to initiate team approaches to conservation followed. And after formal conservation plans and agreements were in place, funding and momentum to implement conservation actions followed. Now these trout are secure enough that we no longer consider them a sensitive species. And that's all I have for you guys. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer any.
Thanks, Kate. Any questions from the board?
No questions. I just want to tell you, thank you. That was something that very interesting, very good data. Thank you.
You're welcome. Glad to share.
Any more questions for Kate? Hearing none, we'll move on to bat species with Kimberly Hersey, Mammal Conservation Coordinator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. And thank you so much for the opportunity to come here today and be the last talk of the day about a group of species that are I find highly interesting and very important, bats. Next slide, please. So bats are the only true flying mammals. Others glide, but they're the only groups of mammals that truly fly. And within Utah, we have 18 documented species. All of them are insectivores, which means they exclusively eat insects. You know, they can help out with mosquito control, but they really prefer bigger insects like moths. And this is really important agriculturally because they're taking care of some of those pest insects. They're found in nearly every habitat in the state, except for the salt flats where there's no water or food available. And they have different winter ecology needs. Because they are insect eaters, they can't stick around and be active through the winter. So we have one group of bats, probably about 4 or 5 different species that primarily migrate out of the state like birds. And we'll often have those sort of showing up around people's houses as September or so. You guys still have the presentation?
No, we lost it.
Sorry about that. And then our other, lots of our other bats are hibernators. So they'll go into cracks and crevices in rock outcrops or mines and caves and hole away for the winter until insects become available again. And bats will use a variety of roosts throughout the year. Lots of them use trees, they'll use homes. They'll also use caves, mines, rock outcrops. Next slide, please. So why are bats considered a conservation concern? We often think about bats as, you know, rodents with wings, and really they have a vastly different life history. They're usually very long-lived species. They can live up to about 40 years. They have a really low reproductive output. You're looking at 1, occasionally 2 pups a year as compared to big litters of mice or rats. And then they have those specialized life history needs. They need a cave or a mine or a rock crack that just has the right combination of temperatures to be able to make it through the winter or to raise their young. And so when you put all that together, you know, there often will be more species of conservation concern because they're just not able to recover as quickly as some other species. Next slide, please. And there's also quite a few different threats to bat populations. A disturbance in those specialized roosts, destruction and alteration of habitat, improperly timed or done nuisance control can be a threat to bats. We try to, you know, just shift that work to different times. Wind power development can threaten bats. Also things like drought and disease. And a big thing is the lack of knowledge. They're flying around in the dark, they're small, they're holding up during the day, which just makes them really difficult to study. Next. So our management goals for bats are to maintain sustainable populations and distributions through the state. And again, this is to prevent the need for federal Endangered Species Act listing. And like others, we want to focus on those proactive, voluntary conservation measures to make sure we get ahead of the curve. And again, like others, we use lots of partnerships. We have a group called the Utah Bat Conservation Cooperative, where we get together a couple times a year to share information, come up with management actions, and bring others up to speed. Next. So we have implemented a lot of different management actions for bats over the years. We've done a lot of research and monitoring. We've had a statewide protocol in place since 2009, where we go out and try to monitor our bat populations every 3 years. And we also do specialized research trying to figure out some of these critical life history needs. We also do things like roost protection. We work with the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining quite a bit in their abandoned mines program. They want to get those abandoned mine hazards off the landscape, but oftentimes those are important habitat for bats. So we identify those mines that are the most important habitat, and we'll put up gates like this, which, you know, remove the hazard, but let the bats stay there. We've also recently got a conservation agreement on a roost of bats that are using a barn way out in western Utah that allows the bats stay there, but gives the landowners some incentive to keep those on their property. We also do things like habitat assessment. On that picture there, you see a dark spot on the tree. Bats like to use loose sloughing bark on tree, so we can mimic that. That's a piece of artificial bark. We also like to enhance water on the landscape. Small changes to stock ponds can make them really helpful for bats. So just doing, you know, those proactive measures that help bats out. And of course, bats often get a bad rap, the spooky, scary creatures of the night. And so we found that education really has helped people to understand, care about these species, be less afraid of them, but also have the respect to not touch them. Next slide. So we've been able to document our success. Again, I said we've got a statewide monitoring plan in place. And since 2009, we've seen stable to increasing populations of most of our bat species. And this is good news. We've also gotten a lot more information on their distribution, found them in the places we expect them to be, you know, some of them greatly increasing our knowledge, building databases to share this information. So for right now, we feel like we're in a great place, but unfortunately, things may be changing. Next, please. And that's because of a pandemic, which I'm sure we're all sick and tired of hearing about, but this one is called white nose syndrome. This is a disease that is caused by a fungus and it affects hibernating bats. Remember that some of our bats migrate, those species aren't affected. But those bat species that rely on their fat stores to get through the winter can be affected by this disease called white nose syndrome. It was first detected in New York in 2006, 2007, and since then it's killed millions of bats across the continent. Importantly, at some hibernaculum sites, they see 90 to 100% mortality. And in the east, you'll see huge aggregations of bats in caves. You know, some are hibernating 300,000 bats. So the biologists would go out there to do their counts and just find piles and piles of dead bats. You know, really disheartening. And it's affected 12 species so far. Next slide. And I say so far because, you know, at this point, it's just moving into the Western states where we get a different suite of species. You see, you know, the blue areas, it's been there for a decade or so, but in states like Wyoming and Texas and California, Washington, it's just been spreading over the last couple of years. We do disease surveillance and haven't found it yet, but unfortunately, we expect that it will show up within probably the next 5 years. Next slide. So far, 6 different species that are found in Utah have been found with documented mortality due to the disease. The interesting thing is different bats respond differently. You know, some species like the big brown bat, although they've been found with white nose syndrome, it hasn't had population level impacts. So that's not really been that big of a concern. Whereas others like the little brown bat, which is a species found in Utah, it's actually found out throughout most of the continental United States and Canada up to Alaska, has had those really high level mortality in eastern states. But we also know that, their life history strategies are different as they move west. So hopefully we can find through monitoring efforts and work that we do here that they won't be as affected in Western states. We also have 4 other species that have been documented with white nose syndrome, and we just don't know too terribly much at this point. They've just been documented within the last year or 2, so we don't know what the population level effects may be, whether they're more towards the big brown bat or the little brown bat side. Next slide, please. And we also know that white nose syndrome is leading to Endangered Species Act listings, and that's why we want to get ahead of this. The Indiana bat, for example, has been endangered since the 1970s, one of the first species put on the list. And they had great success. They were meeting management objectives, even starting to have chatters about delisting of the species, which would be really important because, nearly every project in the within its range that has a federal nexus is having to do mitigation surveys for this species. It slows down a lot of projects. And unfortunately, white nose syndrome has impacted the recovery of the species, and it probably won't be delisted in the near future. Also, the northern long-eared bat has been listed due to the effects of white nose syndrome. That makes it as far west as eastern Montana or so. And there's also current litigation that's trying to reclassify it as endangered rather than threatened, which will increase the oversight of that species. So again, these are things we want to avoid, and 2 species are currently under review for Endangered Species Act consideration. One of those is the tricolored bat, also just an eastern species, but the other is the little brown bat. Through all those efforts that we've been able to accomplish over the last, especially the last decade, but throughout, the history of the non-game program, we're able to provide a lot of information to the Fish and Wildlife Service when they ask for it, showing, at this point, we've got abundant and stable populations. We're taking management actions for this species. And at this point, we don't feel like Endangered Species Act listing would be warranted. And we'll also, continue to watch it as white nose moves in and can demonstrate that hopefully the ecology is different in the West. And we expect a listing decision on that by the end of 2022. Next slide, please. So given that this is a non-native disease, probably came from Europe, that moved into the country, what can we do? How can we establish that track record to show that these species don't need to be listed? First and foremost, we need to gather the data, look for the disease, monitor the population, learn more about those areas that they're hibernating. Also, for the past decade or so, we've had a focus on prevention of the introduction of white nose into the state. Although it's primarily spread bat to bat, it can also be likely spread by cavers, inadvertently moving spores around, people even going up to Timpanogos Cave for the day. So, partners like the Park Service do screening to make sure people aren't inadvertently introducing the disease into the state. And that's bought us a lot of time, and a lot of work has been going on during that time to understand and hopefully treat the disorder. We're also supporting research. We've had different research groups come into Logan Cave to try to figure out how Western bats will be affected, and what the hibernation physiology is, whether we think the bats will be able to make it through the winter. And when they come available, we're going to be ready. The information that we'll have will be ready to apply treatments. They've got all sorts of things that you can spray on a bat and it will kill the fungus. And so, as those are developed, They're working on things like vaccines, different probiotic treatments. There's all sorts of interventions and treatments in the work. So the more time we can buy, the more information we have, the better we can be set to apply those as they become available. We also want to do things on the landscape to increase the survivorships of bats that are infected. Like we find out with deer, bats make it better through the winter than thin ones. So, making sure that our bats have good habitat, they can get good and fat before they head into the winter, and they'll be more likely to survive white nose syndrome when and if it makes it to the state. And again, we just need to implement and document those conservation efforts. So we have a track record of it as a state saying, these are the actions that we're taking and why the management authority should rest with us. Next slide, please. So, this slide sort of unfortunately sums up where we are. Bats are the most important consumer of night flying insects that are agricultural and human pest. And beyond, wanting to keep them off the ESA, we want to keep these on the landscape because they're important ecological role. Next slide, please. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and thank you on behalf of all the other speakers as well for taking time out of your day to learn about, this group of critters and the work that we're doing.
Thanks, Kimberly. Any questions for Kimberly from the board?
I don't have a question. I just want to thank everyone for all the presentations today. This has been very eye-opening for me, and there's so much that goes on behind the scenes at the DWR that I hadn't even thought of before. So it's been very, very informational for me. So thank you for everyone.
Mr. Chairman, this is Wade. I'd also echo what Randy has said. This has been extremely helpful for me. It's been beneficial to be able to learn more about these, but also understand the process, understand a little of the history behind it, where the act came from, where the responsibility lies. And obviously it sounds like we're going a little different direction with the act, or potentially going a little different direction with the Sensitive Species Act. But I think this has been helpful for me just to get me up to speed a little bit. So thank you for everyone. It's very insightful.
Thanks, Wade. Been very educational. Anybody else?
Yep, this Carl, just same thing. Love these reports. These are animals that we probably see but don't think a lot about, but I appreciate all the effort everybody's putting into keeping them here.
Yeah, Byron, this is Donnie. I'd also like to thank these, you educated us very well and lots of good success stories. Thank you for all you do.
Thanks, Donnie.
Anybody
else?
A question. Since 2001, when the Sensitive Species List was implemented, do we feel like in the state of Utah having that list helped us have more clout or be able to protect them more than, say, just the WAP, the Wildlife Action Plan? And second part of that question, do we feel like in any way going back to the WAP will have any effect on carrying weight with the federal agency?
Who are you directing that to, Kevin?
Whoever feels they may best be able to answer that.
I can try to address that. If that's okay. Sure, Byron.
Go ahead, Mike.
Back we had a sensitive species list, as several people have mentioned today, back in the 90s at least, and maybe even earlier than that. That predates me, but it wasn't formalized until 2001. So that's kind of when we had the formal process and rule. I think it helped us to have it formalized because there was then something that was a little more official. But now we have the WAP. For those of you that don't know, the Wildlife Action Plan has been mentioned several times today. It requires us to identify species of conservation need. And then once we've done that, those species are available for federal funding from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so we've been using that list, as Tyler Thompson mentioned. That's the list WRI uses. That's a more current list anyway. The sensitive species list was a little bit out of date, which is why we were trying to update it now. So I think it is a little confusing to have two lists. It's a little redundant. I don't think we need that. I also mentioned earlier, I have been in communication with the Forest Service and the BLM, and they couldn't give me final answers. They've gone back to DC to try and get final answers, but they both believe that they can use our working lists or our list in the Wildlife Action Plan quite easily. Just adapt that instead of using the sensitive species list. So I think we'll still be okay. The important thing is we can still do the work and prioritize what needs to get done and have some funding for that.
I
Did
have
that answer your question, Kevin?
Yeah, and then my follow-up to that would be, I know it's a little bit unknown, and we all have a hope. You've asked the question to the federal agencies, but will it carry the same weight for funding? Will we get the same amount of funding to be able to do the incredible work? I've had the opportunity to sit around the table with the division on many of these species, and if it wasn't for that funding and for the work that the division's done, we'd be sitting in a lot different place with many of the species, especially sage grouse and prairie dogs and many of the ones that I've worked with. So I've been very appreciative of this process, but just follow up. Do you think that we will have the same weight in getting the funding?
I think we will. The vast majority of our sensitive species funding comes from ESMF, the program that Chris Keleher manages. And I think we'll be okay there. That's the state funding. And then matching that are the federal funds associated with the Wildlife Action Plan from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And those funds definitely do not use the sensitive species list. They already use that Wildlife Action Plan list. So I think funding wise, we will be okay.
Thank you. And then just one last follow-up comment, and that would be when we have problems, who we go to is the state. When Brett Selman, when Wade Heaton has that species that the federal government wants to list, who do they go to? It's not the phone call to Uncle Sam. It's the phone call to the locals. It's to the state agency that says, hey, what do we do with the prairie dog? What do we do with the sage grouse? And the fear is that, do we hurt ourselves by doing this? Does Brett Selman have that same phone call if we lose that list? And that's a fear that I personally have. I know that this is not something that the agency is taken lightly. I know there's a lot of local pressure, more so than we probably even understand. But I personally have that fear. And I wouldn't be true with myself if I didn't state that fear and give that comment to all of you.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Brett.
This is Brett. Where does this Wildlife Action Plan list come from? Who makes that list?
There's a 10-year plan, the Wildlife Action Plan. It's a 10-year plan. We're currently in the second iteration of that. So we've had one for about 15 years, I believe. And it's created through a multi-jurisdictional team and review process that includes all the different federal agencies. I believe the Farm Bureau was involved, Department of Agriculture. They work through, look at all the data, and kind of prioritize which species have threats to them, and which should be a priority to stop species from being federally listed. And that information is all available in our Wildlife Action Plan, which is on our website, if you're interested in looking at that.
Okay, thank you. And I likewise would like to thank everybody. We've had bat surveys and bird surveys on our ranches for a variety of different reasons, and I've learned a ton about those creatures through those surveys. And we've had scout groups and everything else with those surveys, and it's an amazing educational thing to know what all is out there. So thanks again from me too all these presentations.
Wade, do you have a question or remarks?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to kind of speak to what Kevin had mentioned. This kind of stuff is right in Kevin's wheelhouse. He certainly understands it probably a lot better than the rest of us as he works with this in his business life. So I appreciate his comments, and I mean, I know I'm the one that kind of raised some concerns at the last board meeting and wanted to learn more about this, and so I do appreciate this opportunity. And I guess I want to go on the record of saying I 100% support the idea that this gets managed at the state level. The last thing we want is for any of these species to be listed on the endangered list and to be try to be managed by the feds. And that's obviously the larger concern that obviously all of us have. I think we're all on the same page here. And I recognize that names are just semantics and it probably does not matter. Sensitive species list, yeah, that does throw up a lot of antennas. And it sounds like maybe some at the legislature, just given this recent direction that they've or have given us. If we can accomplish the same thing with a less redundant, without having two lists, and you know, we can accomplish the same work, I'm probably comfortable there. But I agree with Kevin. This work has got to go on. We've got to safeguard the funding for it. We've got to make sure this work happens so that we can keep these species out of the hands of the feds. I think that is everyone's biggest concern here.
Mike, can you speak to that? Wade's comments, Mike Canning.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I mentioned to the Natural Resources Subcommittee, Interim Committee yesterday was, one thing I like to do as director is when we have a process and it's up for review or it's up for updating, I like to ask the question, are we redundant? Are we being efficient? Are we doing the right thing? And I don't think I asked enough questions with regard to updating the sensitive species list. Now, I know we updated it in 2018, but the fact of the matter is we have a new process in place that came about with the statewide grants, federal funding, and that's the Wildlife Action Plan. And there was a bit of redundancy here, and I believe we can build a better process moving forward. And that's why the division is changing its recommendation. It's not so much that we're running away from a problem. We just think we have the ability under the Wildlife Action Plan and the designation of species of greatest conservation need to move forward and continue to do this work. If I thought this was going to adversely affect our funding sources, our funding streams, or adversely affect the work that we do, I wouldn't recommend that. We wouldn't go forward with a new recommendation. But I believe we can build a better and more efficient process for dealing with this stuff and keep these species in state management, keep the funding on the ground, and keep doing good work for wildlife.
Mike, this is Carl. Is there a public process in the Wildlife Action Plan?
I think it asked Mike Canning to speak to that.
I'm trying to remember. I believe it did go through for Wildlife Board approval. I'm almost positive of that. So yes.
Okay, so if we have to approve both boards, then I guess it makes sense, or both lists, it makes sense to have only one list. So are we really just changing the name on this from sensitive species to Wildlife Action Plan? If it goes through the same process, the same species are on there, the Wildlife Board has to approve it, are we really just changing the name?
I don't think we're changing. I think we're streamlining the system. I think the system was there, but I think there was some redundancy in our system, and I think we're just refining and rebuilding our system so that it's more efficient.
Any other comments or questions or other business that the board would like to bring up at this time?
I just want to reaffirm what I just heard. The Wildlife Board does approve the Wildlife Action Plan. Is that correct?
I
Okay.
believe that's the case. I didn't go back and check it. I think I remember that happening, but I will check and verify that for sure. But yes, I'm Chris, do you remember?
I'm about the same boat you are, Mike. I'm pretty sure it is, but I can't say positively.
I think it was, Randy, but I will check for sure.
Hey, Mike, this is Justin Shannon. I vaguely remember it being an informational. I could be wrong on that, but that's what I remember.
We'll go back and check.
Thank you.
Well, I think this has been a very good meeting. And I'd like to thank all the presenters with the information. It was very educational for me. And I'm sure likewise it was for the board, but you've made your comments and stuff. At this point, is there any other business? Hearing none, I accept the motion to adjourn then.
Randy, I'll make that motion.
I have a motion.
I'll second that, Byron.
I have a second. I'll just do a quick roll call. Kevin Albrecht. Is that yes?
Yes.
I lost you there, Kevin. Randy Dirth,
Yes.
Donnie Hunter,
Yes.
Carl Hurst,
Yes.
Wade Heaton,
Yes.
Brett Selman.
Yes.
It's unanimous. We're done with this meeting until our next meeting, which is October 1st. I'd like to thank everyone again for your service, and the information we received today is very knowledgeable, educational, and we'll move on from there. The meeting is now adjourned.